All right, guys, you're here with Josh Thomson, and we're here for Punk's opinion. So I'm going to give you my opinion on the Gegard and Rory Macdonald fight being announced. And basically, for me, I want to just compare the two things. And I know everyone's going to sit here and say that I'm a Bellator jock rider, and because I work for Bellator and I fight for Bellator and do all these other things for Bellator. But as you recall, I fought in Pride, I fought in Dream, I fought in the UFC, 2 stints in the UFC back when there was 5 shows a year versus 5 shows a weekend. So you knew you were a top lightweight or a top fighter when you were signed with them back in 2000 because you only had 5 to 7 shows a year. So look. This fight is, sure, I think it's great. I think it's definitely considered a real super fight. The one thing that I will say, and I'm not criticizing the UFC at all, what I'm saying is that we had all this talk and all this hype for years about GSP and Anderson Silva. And did that fight ever happen? It never happened. We had all these other expectations, all these other high-profile fights. I can't even think of the ones off the top of my head. But like the super fight, the one major super fight that everyone talked about in the UFC was GSP and Anderson Silva. And that fight never happened. Like there was never a moment where you're like, okay, look, this is possibly going to happen. Like even with the Conor stuff. I mean, sure, the Conor fight with Floyd Mayweather happened, but that had nothing, that had something to do, a little bit portion to do with Dana. But the money was just so ridiculously good that there was no way Dana was going to pass up on that. Now, this, though, Bellator is able to finally put something like this together. And they didn't wait. There was no hesitation. There was talk about it right after Gegard won the title. And what better chance and what better opportunity to do it right now when Rory Macdonald is the champion at 170 and also Gegard Mousasi is the champion at 185. This now is the first real, I feel like the first real super fight that promotion's delivered on. I mean, and look, I really believe like even though DC and Stipe is considered like a super fight, but to me it's really a super fight for DC. It's not a super fight for Stipe. I mean, Stipe is considered the best, heavyweight basically ever. But the problem is that, and I love Stipe, man. I think he's great I think he's a great fighter. I think he's extremely talented. I'm not trying to knock him at all. No diss to him whatsoever. But the hype around him is not there, and it's not the same as if it was a John Jones, Brock Lesnar fight, or even a DC and John Jones fight again. Any GSP, Anderson Silva, those fights were considered like super fights. Even a Conor and GSP fight, those are true super fights. This to me this has all the things like Gegard left. He left the UFC. When he left the UFC, he left on some wins. He also left when he left on the wins. He was basically next in line for a title shot, or was going to be next in line for a title shot. Rory Macdonald had fought for the title, had lost to Robbie Lawler in just probably one of the most epic fights and 5-round fights in history. And what a great performance. Now he comes over, has a good win against Paul Daly, had a tough war against Douglas Lima, who is huge for the weight. If you actually want to put Lima and Mousasi next to each other, I'd be willing to bet that Lima's probably just a tiny bit smaller, not even something you would really like recognize walking down the street. You'd be like, oh, again, they're about the same size. So when you're comparing these two things, I really believe this to me is a real true super fight, and they actually made it happen so fast. There wasn't talk for 2-3 years. They delivered. They delivered quickly, and they delivered right when the moment was right. Rory Macdonald is the champion, and he's ready to fight. Gegard Mousasi is champion with a quick finish in his title fight, and now the two of them are set to face in September 29th in San Jose at the SAP Arena. I mean, honestly, like all the talk and all the hype for years from all the super fights that we were ever talked about, none of them had really ever delivered. I can't think of one right off the top of my head, other than the Conor and Mayweather fight. I mean, that's like, that's huge, man. That's a real huge delivery. But that wasn't just in the UFC though. That was done with another boxing promoter, another network, a whole other deal, a whole other situation. But this is going to be a great fight. Then also you're getting that Quinton and Silva fight again as the co-main event. That should be another great fight. So, I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of when you're talking super fights and you're talking fights that fans really truly wanted to see that never got the chance to see them. this is the fight. We never got to see the Anderson Silva and the GSP, and that kind of is the one thing that I think a lot of fans would all love to have seen, but the UFC never really delivered truly on their super fight talk. What's another, producer Dave, can you think of any other super fight talks that I'm missing?
Wanderlei versus Chael Sonnen.
Wanderlei versus Chael. Well, I mean,
I'm being somewhat sarcastic.
I can't think of any super fights that we really missed out on. I mean, like that were talked about that they just never delivered on. Yeah. I mean,
the only one that's been talked about that's not happened is DJ and TJ.
Yeah, DJ and TJ not delivered on yet either. I mean, that was something like, they're both champions. Why hasn't it been delivered on? Yeah. TJ was willing to go to 125. That could have been a great super fight. I wouldn't say it's the level of the Gegard and Rory, but
do you think it's interesting how DJ refused that fight and Dana acts like it's not a big deal, but then as soon as Yair refuses the fight, he gets cut?
Yeah, it's hard to get rid of your champions, man.
I get it.
That's the hardest part, is to get rid of your champions. You don't want to cut them. You've put a lot of money and time and invested lots of money into promoting them, and the last thing you want to do is get rid of him. And also, too, you go ahead and cut him, and I think promotions would line up to sign him. But, I mean, realistically, it comes down to numbers, and I don't know if DJ is a big draw because of the weight. He is so small. Definitely entertaining for me. I like watching. He's a technician, man. I've trained with his coach, Matt Hume, for the longest time, a couple times, and I've traveled with him for ONE FC, and the guy's just a full-on technician. Even working and grappling a little bit with Rich Franklin, same idea, same concept. Very, very, very good, very fluid, very a great coach, both of them, Rich Franklin and Matt Hume. But back to this. The UFC just never delivered on any of their big super fights. I mean, the one fight, obviously, I've mentioned a couple of times now, is the GSP and Anderson Silva fight. It just never came about, and all the talk, all the hype, is it time to make that fight? It was all this conversation. It never happened, I can't think of any other super fight that you could really think of. I mean, like if Conor and GSP were to fight, yes. But I don't even consider like Khabib and Conor. That's not a super fight. Those are the two guys in the same weight class. That's not a super fight. We're talking, big time super fights that could be made for these organizations. I mean, realistically, I feel like a super fight, and the only reason why you call them super fights is, I mean, would be like DC and Brock Lesnar. That's a super fight, because when I'm thinking super fights, I'm thinking super fights in terms of, will it be a good fight? Will it bring in viewership? Will it, will it fill in the seats? Will the crowd, will the arena be full? It's hard to do those things these days. They're so overfilled with all of this stuff. You know what I mean? There's so many shows every week, every so often, and I don't know, man. Fedor's not Fedor, but I just saw Fedor up on the screen. That's why. But these guys, the super fights just haven't happened yet, and I'm excited to see. And I'll give you an example. I speak from experience. Maybe you're not, I don't want to call it a super fight either, but the fights that people had talked about with me when I was in Strikeforce forever was Donald Cerrone and Josh Thomson, Anthony Pettis and Josh Thomson. Those fights were never offered to me as soon as I came to the UFC. So those are the fights that I was like asking for, wanting to fight and getting, and it was just never offered to me. It was never something on the table. And I don't know I don't know what their overall game plan is. I don't understand their logic behind not trying to really put these super fights together. I don't know. So that's like more of an inside track into what they're thinking. At that time, it was Joe Silva, Dana White, and Sean Shelby. Now it's whoever's running it along with Dana White and Sean Shelby. So I couldn't tell you exactly why, but for some reason it's just not. They're not getting the big super fights together.
Do you think this will have a big impact as far as Bellator's viewership?
Yes, I do. I think it's just the beginning, though, too. There's a lot of I just had a couple, conferences and a couple little conversations in chat through some of my sources through Bellator. There's a lot of big things coming up for this next year. And I got to tell you, I'm extremely excited. So after this fight happens between Rory and Gegard, there's a lot of big news that they'll be dropping pretty much around the same time. So I'd be ready to go, man. This is gonna be great. So I mean, that's really my take on this whole deal. When you start thinking about Bellator has finally come through and delivered a super fight, a true super fight, 170 pounder versus 185 pounder. And when we talk about the talent and the level of the guys in this town, Rory Macdonald is probably one of the most technical fighters out there. He has a current win over current UFC welterweight champion Tyron Woodley, and he's looking to go ahead and go up to 185, become a 2-weight class champion in Bellator. And you can't be mad at that, man. I'm excited for that. He signed on the dotted line. He didn't just talk about it. He did it. There was no hesitation. I mean, and you can appreciate somebody who does that. And with Gegard, I mean, he's talented on the ground. He's definitely really good on the feet. You know, he sometimes fights at a little bit slower pace, but for a 5-round fight, I mean, he's got the size over Rory, but there's not much of a size difference. So I wouldn't expect to see Gegard just walk through him. I mean, Rory's such a technician. There's a lot of good things that Rory can do to Gegard and help push the pace on this fight and try and potentially even get Gegard tired. I feel like the level of talent from 170 and below supersedes the level of talent from 185 and above. So when you're talking technique and talking skill level, and don't get me wrong, this is not a knock at Gegard either. When you're talking technique and skill level, Rory, I think, has got a little bit of the upper hand. And overall, I think fighter IQ in there when he's in there fighting. He's also made some bonehead mistakes by trying to stand and trade, knowing he was up on the cards that cost him potential fights. But realistically, as a fight fan and a true fight fan and someone who was a fighter himself, man, that kind of gives me a hard on. You know, it's one of those things that it's great to see someone go out there and truly lay it on the line and let it all hang out. And, you know, and he's done that before several times, even costing himself the fights in those moments. You go back to when he first fought Carlos Condit. He was beating Carlos Condit 2 rounds, and he came out and tried to finish him in the third and gassed himself out so bad that he ended up losing with less than, I think, 10 seconds left on the clock in the third. You know, and all he had to do was just survive the round. And he couldn't, you know, and Condit just did what Condit does, man. He just, you know, he just keeps beating you with technique, and survives the round. Just a tough SOB, and just came back, was able to get Rory at the end. But that was, I think, want to say Rory's first or second fight in the UFC. He was really young. I want to say he was only 19, maybe 20 years old at the time. And man, he's come a long way since then. Just a totally different fighter and athlete now. I mean, we're talking years ago, but this is impressive, man. So hats off to Bellator for signing this fight. No hesitation. And hats off to Rory and Gegard, to both of you guys sign on the dotted line. You know, and that'll wrap us, man.